Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to what's a continuation of our reflecting on Morgan's history and its legacy. This is Founders Day at Morgan. Our guest speaker today, as with convocation, is Dr. Nancy Elizabeth Fitch. She is also today our distinguished historian in residence. We'll be talking about something that a lot of people don't know a lot about, except if you were at convocation this morning. You know something more than many of us do and did. And that is the Virginia Collegiate Industrial Institute. I got the name right. Which was in Lynchburg. And as you'll discover as we proceed, that was one of the outposts of what we think of as Morgan College. There were others, and we'll hear about those today also. And some of the connections of that deep history to what we can see today at Morgan State University. So with no further ado, I will start with letting everyone who's here assembled on this panel to introduce themselves. We'll start with Dr. Fitch and let her have a few opening remarks to introduce herself to you.
Okay. I'm Nancy Elizabeth Fitch. I used to live in Lynchburg, and I taught at Lynchburg College and Randolph-Macon Women's College. I discovered the two branch schools of Morgan College when I was working at the Library of Congress and then EEOC. And I had no idea what Lynchburg was, but I ended up teaching there. And then I remembered that there had been a school there, and it's been an adventure for the last 30 years. As people have indicated, a lot of people, even in Lynchburg, don't know much about the school, so I didn't get much help in trying to dig up information. And over the years, I've got half of a room of documents. And I'm really grateful for that, but I was so grateful to be here today because I wanted to get the story out to more people and hoping that people would find it interesting. So I threw out things that hopefully other people can pursue, like I. Garland Penn, who was one of the people that made sure that there was a school in Virginia. It was supposed to be in the Valley of Virginia. Lynchburg's not the Valley, but
We'll come and get into some more of those
Okay.
details, including geography.
Okay.
Americans are challenged by geography, so we'll have to give a little bit of a grounding in that too. I guess I didn't say who I am either to start with. I'm moderating today, and I'm E.R. Shipp. I'm an associate professor in the School of Global Journalism and Communication. And I am a history buff, among other things, and was fascinated when I learned what I now know about Morgan's history. We have four distinguished people at this end of the set of tables here, and they will introduce themselves in a little bit more detail. I guess I'll start with, why don't we start with you, Dr. Barrett?
Hi, my name is Simone Barrett. I am the administrative specialist for the Robert M. Bell Center. I am a triple bear. Most of my research is based, well, not most of it, all of it is based on Morgan's history. My thesis looked at Lovely Lane United Methodist Church, which is the mother church of American Methodism. It was founded in Baltimore, and its effect on the African American community of Baltimore, which includes two of the oldest churches in Baltimore, Sharp Street, Bethel AME, and also the Centenary Biblical Institute came out of this collaboration. My dissertation is based on Morgan student-led protests. So I look at Morgan students and their protest activities from 1935 to the present day.
And Warren?
And I'm Warren Howes. I'm a member of the class of 1967. We call ourselves the Centennial class of 1967, the soulful centennial.
Soulful centennial. I didn't hear that part at lunch. Okay.
And as I said, this is my 51st year. Well, I guess I might add 3. My 54th year, when I count 63, being affiliated with Morgan. I was honored to have been asked to serve on the Sesquicentennial Committee, which has been a real honor. When I was a student at Morgan, we celebrated the university's 100th anniversary. I can say that it wasn't with the same amount of glamour and the same amount of research and interest in history that we have seen with the 150th, which has really excited my passion. I was very blessed when I was here to have been taught by some of the most brilliant historians in the world. Dr. Benjamin Qualls, a renowned historian, influenced by Dr. Hollis's, one of Dr. Hollis's teachers, Dr. Waters Turpin, who in his own right was a historical grand master. And one of the things I remember Dr. Quarles always said was that, look at that word history, it's his story. And we must make certain that we continue to make sure that we tell our story. And until this year, we really had not told the complete story of Morgan's history, and I'm very proud to be a part of this telling.
Thank you. And Professor Green.
Good afternoon. I'm Dale Green, a professor of architecture and historic preservation here at Morgan State University, and also a graduate of Morgan State University class of 2005, and the 6th great-grandson of Reverend Samuel Green Sr., who was one of our 5 African-American visionary founders. I've had a great opportunity to work with the university over the years on uncovering the history of Morgan State University and working to preserve our historic buildings on the campus. So this has been a remarkable journey leading up to today to uncover this legacy of one of our branches in the Virginia area.
Dr. Johnson.
Greetings, I'm Edwin Johnson. I'm a member of the class of 1992. I currently serve as the Assistant University Archivist. I've been here in some capacity since I completed Morgan in May of '92. My major research interest as a historian is the systematic disenfranchisement of African Americans in urban environments. So the conversation about Morgan and its place and its distinction as being the first institution in the state of Maryland to provide the opportunity for people of color to earn the liberal arts degree and to gain liberal arts training has always been of interest to me. So this and Dr. Fitch's research is just invaluable in my mind in terms of broadening that conversation to encompass the state of Virginia as well.
Excellent. So we're going to jump right into this, but I want to start with Dr. Fitch. The topic that you've become known for is not one that would just jump out at most people, that there was an institution that was a feeder institution into
Yes.
Morgan,
Yes.
right? First of all, how did you get interested in the general topic of history, and what led you to Virginia Collegiate?
Well, once I moved from South Asian history to American history and then African American history, I was interested in historically black colleges and universities. I can't tell you what started that, except for the fact that my mother always wanted me to go to one. She wanted me to go to Howard. That's another story. But anyway, I started making lists of historically black colleges, HBCUs, not PBIs, predominantly black institutions, which are institutions that were founded after 1954. So to be a historically black college, they've changed the terminology, but I'm sticking to what I know. It's up until 1954. And I made lists of constituent parts of schools that exist now or that no longer exist. At 9/11, I had all of these things floating around in my office, and I threw everything out in desperation. Not because of the topic, but I just thought, well, does it make any difference at this point? So I don't have that information, and it was very, very hard. It took me a long time to make lists. But I've always been interested as a historian, or just as a human being, in things that didn't seem to have ready answers, in gaps in history, gaps in life, and that's what led me to trip over Morgan's 2, 3, depending on how you count, branch schools. So when I ended up in Lynchburg, I remembered that there had been a school there. Nobody helped me. Everybody said I was talking about the school in Petersburg. Part of the problem with this topic is that the school reminds people of other schools, West Virginia, Industrial and Collegiate. I've got 10 schools that people think are VCII, and I tell them that they're wrong.
But those
But-
had all been black institutions?
Some of them
Those
were,
others?
most of them were black institutions, yeah. And I forgot the name of Virginia State University's earlier name, but people would always say, oh, after I tell them I've been working on this school in Lynchburg, you must mean the school in Petersburg. And I always took that as an insult. How stupid am I? I've been working on this for some time, and you're telling me that I got the school mixed up with the one in Petersburg.
People like to tell you that you don't know what you're talking about.
Yes,
People do
yeah.
that all the time.
And it kind of got my back up. So as much as I am happy with the research, I've been unhappy with people, including some friends of mine that weren't listening to what I was saying.
Now, I believe there are about 105-ish recognized HBCUs. Someone may know if that.
Yeah, I
number's
used to know
right.
the number, but I
Something
forgot.
like that now. But there have been others.
Yes, lots
that
of
have
others.
lots more over the years. Some have gone out of business. Some have merged with others. So we're looking at Morgan State University now. Before it became the institution that it is now, there were other schools that were a part of it. And we'll talk about what happened to them along the way. I think I'm going to start a little bit with Dr. Barrett to kind of lay a little bit of groundwork with the Methodist Church having played a very major part in the founding of this institution here in Baltimore, but also some of the others. So if you give us a little bit of that, and then we'll talk a little bit more about Virginia.
Okay. As I stated in my introduction.
Oh, are you picking us up with the microphones? Are we good?
Okay. As I stated in my introduction, the Mother Church of American Methodism is at the corner of St. Paul and 22nd Street. A lot of people don't know that, but it's called Lovely Lane United Methodist Church. It was founded by John Fillmore, Francis Asbury, and Robert Strawbridge. And it was founded in the late 1700s, like 1774 is when they first started the first chapel. They built a large church in 1784 after the Christmas conference. I don't know what it is about the Methodists when they form something. It seems to be on Christmas Day. Yeah, this institution was formed on Christmas Day, but they formed this church in 1784. And what made the Methodists different? They accepted black people initially. Okay, after they had a lot of black members, they started relegating them. They couldn't take communion, they had to wait after, they couldn't sit with the white people, they had to go on the balcony, and they left. A contingent of them left, and they formed the Colored Methodist Society. This was like 1797. They formed the Colored Methodist Society. And it's always a battle between St. George's and Lovely Lane, which delegation, black delegation, left first. Maryland left 2 weeks before St. George's, but what made St. George's more recognizable, they had a building they could go directly into. The Colored Methodist Society did not. They met in people's homes until the early 1800s. So that's why they say that the St. George's Church in Philadelphia was formed, where their Colored Methodist Society was formed before ours. But out of this Methodist Society came Sharp Street Church, Bethel AME, and of course, the Centenary Biblical Institute.
Okay. Now, the years you're mentioning, that was when slavery was still in existence.
Exactly.
So are we talking about free blacks who were doing this, or
Well,
were enslaved people involved in these churches?
You could come to church if you were enslaved. However, they were very, how can I put it? You could come and worship, but you could not hold any type of offices. You could not be a lay minister or things like that. You could just come and worship if you were enslaved. But if you were free, you could become part of the management of the church. And I think that's because maybe some freedom issues or something were talked about during these meetings, and they didn't want the enslaved people to go back to their masters to tell them.
And Mr. Howes, you were mentioning when we were talking earlier something about some of the conditions that existed here just after the Civil War. Do you want to give us a little taste of what was going on before we get back to how Centennial was founded and how Lynchburg was founded?
Right. Well, in Baltimore, you had the largest free black population on the East Coast, in the country, actually. But you also had a sizable slave population. They interacted very well, so to speak. But we had organization. The thing that I was so impressed with within the Methodist and within Lovely Lane, coming out of Lovely Lane, was the caliber of leadership. It just amazes me how these people developed the minds and the charisma of these people. Sharp Street was what you would call at that time, for example, a mega church. According to the minutes, and I have a copy of those. Sometimes you might want to look at some of this stuff. But these are some of the early minutes, 1864, from the first annual conference of the first meeting of the Washington Annual Conference. But it listed here that Sharp Street had something like 1,600 parishioners, members. That's a mega church.
Yeah.
And that was
They probably don't have that many today.
They don't. They don't.
Yeah, I don't know. Anybody know Sharp Street Church?
Around 35.
Around 35.
Right.
Wow.
Yeah.
So we're talking about numbers here, and you have strength in numbers. And one of the other things that's so fascinating about this story is that these people that I'm speaking of, our original visionary founders who are listed in here, coming out of the Methodist Church, Benjamin Brown, James Peck, James Harper, Elijah Grissom, were elected with the church. Let me state this. Simone mentioned, Dr. Barrett mentioned the fact that started way back in 1797, the parishioners walked out. They walked out of the church, and they wanted to assert leadership over their own lives. That was one of the points that they made. They wanted leadership over their own lives. So here are people who are living in slavery, despised as our Board of Regents chairman said this morning, deprivation, the worst kinds of abuses. But here these people are coming out of a church, and as early as 1840, I'm jumping, these people began to argue that we want our own conference within the Methodist Church so that we can take charge of our own life. We want to build schools. We want to train leaders. Well, they got rejected each time, starting in 1848. Finally, in 1864, the white Methodists capitulated, and they established two conferences. The first was the Delaware Conference in July, and the second one was the Washington Conference, which came about on October 28th of 1864. So this is in the midst of the war. I mean, which is fascinating. This is in the midst of the Great War, that these black people are preparing for the end of the war.
And the Washington Conference included Baltimore.
Yes, and the Washington Conference included Baltimore. There were two, Washington and Delaware. Now, these two conferences were significant in forming Morgan. These two conferences were instrumental in forming Morgan. And the Delaware Conference was instrumental in establishing the Princess Anne Academy.
This is the first time we're hearing Princess Anne in the room. So quickly tell us Princess Anne.
School. So it's also amazing. Look at this institution. One of the questions I wanted to ask too was, here's Morgan establishing other institutions. So this is a leadership role, again, asserting leadership.
Well, before we go too far, because now we've gone from 1860 to talking about Princess Anne, so we need to slow down a little bit here. Dale, Professor Green, before we go too much further, tell us a little bit about Samuel Green and how those men were coming together to lay the groundwork for the school that became Morgan.
Yeah, so my sixth great-grandfather, Reverend Samuel Green, was born enslaved on Maryland's Eastern Shore in Dorchester County in the year 1802. And he purchased his freedom along with his wife in 1834. In 1854, he helped his son, Samuel Green Jr., escape along the Underground Railroad with the assistance of his first cousin, who was Harriet Green Ross Tubman.
Ever heard of her?
Yes.
And so he escaped, and later, 1857, coinciding with the Dred Scott case, Reverend Samuel Green Sr. was caught possessing a copy of the Uncle Tom's Cabin as a free person. But it was illegal. It was an anti-slavery publication. They arrested him from his home, where they caught him with it. They took him to the Dorchester County Courthouse, where they sentenced him to 10 years in prison. And he was brought right here to Baltimore City, where the Maryland State Penitentiary was, and he was to serve 10 years in prison. He was pardoned by Governor Bradford, who was the same governor who signed Maryland's Emancipation Proclamation on November 1st and established the public school systems in the state of Maryland. But prior to all of that, Reverend Samuel Green began the same level of activism that Mr. Howes talked about with the churches, the Methodist Church in particular, petitioning to establish a school as early as 1852. He was attending conferences at the Colored People's Convention, not only here in Baltimore, but in Philadelphia. And so he had a setback by being arrested in 1857. But no sooner than he got out of jail, Harriet Beecher Stowe gave him a new copy of that book. And we actually have the original portrait of him when he was released with that book. But this was on his mind as much as it was James Peck, who was from Talbot County, an adjacent county to where he was born, and Reverend James Harper, and Reverend Elijah Grissom, and Reverend Benjamin Brown. All of these former enslaved African Americans came from Maryland's Eastern Shore and were clergy, just like my sixth great-grandfather, Reverend Samuel Green, in the Methodist Church. They were coincidentally the same founders who were associated with the Washington Conference, as you've just heard Dr. Barrett and Mr. Howes mention, as well as the Delaware Conference. And so they were visionary founders not only of what was known as the Centenary Biblical Institute, now Morgan State University, but of the first black conferences within the Methodist Church.
Mm-hmm. And Dr. Fitch, what was happening in Virginia around this time?
Well, I think the reason Morgan wanted to go to Virginia is that Virginia was a state that believed in some form of universal public education. And what we also have to remember is Thomas Jefferson, when he wasn't sure whether or not deporting black people was a good idea or not, or if people were going to stay, wanted everybody, including poor white people, to be educated. So the public school education and incorporating black schools into the system was very important, and I think that's why Virginia was selected as a place for this school. Also, the superintendent, Edwin, oh, now I'm going to forget his name, Glass, who became a friend of Frank Triggs, was very interested in having a normal school established in Lynchburg. Frank Trigg was part of the Negro public school, so his boss was the superintendent, Superintendent Glass. And I think that, and I. Garland Penn was also a teacher and a superintendent in the Negro public schools in Lynchburg. I think all of those factors and those personalities gelled at some point, and when the Morgan said we need a school in the Valley of Virginia, that's where it ended up.
Okay, so
in Lynchburg.
Morgan is in Baltimore.
Morgan's in Baltimore.
Why does it need a school in the Valley of Virginia?
Well, the big thing is Morgan was so, had such a great reputation, everybody wanted to go there. They didn't have any room in the new building that they were building on Edmonton and Fulton Avenue. So
Slow that down. Edmondson and Fulton Avenue. Can you imagine that was where Morgan was?
And you know, there was a gas leak on Edmonton yesterday. Anyway, Edmonton yesterday. But They had no room. They moved the principal and his family out of the building because it couldn't hold everybody, and they put students in there. They also had several other buildings in Baltimore for women students, but they needed another place. So that's part of what happened with Delaware Academy that becomes Princess Anne. And then I think Virginia was just, it was another kind of environment. It was an environment that was receptive to public education for black people. And that's where and they had connections. The Methodist Episcopal Church with I. Garland Penn, who was a major executive in the Methodist Episcopal Church, lived there. He went to Jackson Street Methodist Episcopal Church, and he was the person that went to the CME, the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church, St. James, that I've attended a couple of times, and said, what about Lynchburg? And it was the CME church that said, let's see if we can make that happen. They had a conference of CME. I forgot the year. I shouldn't, but I did.
So all of these
people interconnected.
Yes.
Yeah.
When you think about it, it's kind of like
6 degrees of separation.
6 degrees of separation. Yeah, you kind of know somebody who knows somebody, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And remember, we're talking the 1860s
Yeah.
now.
So
right?
everybody did know everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they probably were talking to people in New York and all of those places too. Well, you were mentioned, by the way, blacks walking out of the Methodist church in
yes.
Baltimore and elsewhere. It reminded me of my home church in New York City is Abyssinian Baptist Church.
Yes.
Some people think of that as Adam Clayton Powell's church. And it was 1808 that they did that. So they're one of the oldest black church still in existence in the United States. But there, they were tired of that kind of secondhand treatment in the church, in what's now the First Baptist Church, and staged a walkout. And then there are various stories about how they happened to actually come together as a congregation and take the name Abyssinian. But they did found the church under similar circumstances. I think that was happening in many parts of the East Coast anyway, that black people were asserting their own independence and directing their own, religious livelihood.
But can I say something? Okay. Even though we did walk away from the church, the Colored Methodist Society did split as well. Because even though they let us, well, when I say let us, the Methodists let us have our own meeting places or whatever, but on Sunday morning, there was a white person preaching. And of course, they preached the text that talked about enslavement and, right, and being a good slave to your master and things of that nature. And half of the delegation was like, And that's when they split and they formed Bethel AME, or they got with the delegation in Philadelphia, and they formed the Bethel AME.
That was Richard Allen's church.
Right, the African Methodist Episcopal Church. However, Daniel Coker, who was Baltimore born and bred, was supposed to be the founder of the church, but his mother was white. And they were like, no, if we're going to be called the African Methodist
They
Church,
want African in
we
it.
want somebody that looks African. So that's how that's how Richard Allen got the call to be the founder of the church, and not Daniel Coker, because he was too light.
Oh, amazing. So we're up to, now, Dr. Johnson, you got to jump in here because you said you knew something about everything. But as they were establishing these schools, were they all being thought of as seminaries, which essentially is kind of what Morgan or Centennial was kind of trying to be, right? It was more tied to training people in ministry, right? But were there also schools that were being founded initially as industrial schools?
Oh, absolutely. And well, let's jump back and then go forward. I think it's important that while all of this is happening, and my background is not the history. That's why when you all were talking about the Methodist conferences and stuff, it's like take it and talk about it. But what I see that as is a structure, and when I look at the conferences and the connections, it provided the structure for people of color not only to advocate for themselves, but also to establish institutions for themselves. So if you remember, 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson decision said that separate but equal is constitutional as long as you provide for both races. So you got a library for whites, you have a library for blacks, it's fine. But if you notice, if you look at the state of Maryland, Maryland willfully ignored the Plessy versus Ferguson decision, and I'm going forward, but I'm gonna come back. So it takes Donald Murray and Thurgood Marshall in...
You coming way
Right,
up here,
I'm coming
1930s.
back. Donald Murray and Thurgood Marshall, when Donald Murray is trying to go to law school at the University of Maryland to have that court case. And it was that court case that finally brought attention to the fact that, hey, it's 1935, and in 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson has been on the books and ignored. So when you look at the Delaware Conference Academy, which became the Princess Anne Academy, which we now know as the University of Maryland Eastern Shore, here is the state ignoring the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson decision, but they see the second Morrill Act and of 1890, and they say, hey, the federal government will give money as long as we provide an institution. So even though we
Okay, now slow that one down. You just threw out the Morrill Act. On the second one, no less. We didn't even know about the first one. So let me slow it down a little bit.
One of the major concerns of the nation, if you will, 1862 was the first Morrill Act. The government offered the opportunity to sell land, and the proceeds from the land could be used to establish colleges and universities that championed the mission of agricultural training, primarily. Agricultural, mechanical, agricultural, industrial.
So those are your A&Ts and your A&M
Right, all the
schools.
A&Ts. So with the first Morrill Act, I think we got 2 HBCUs out of the deal, just 2. So it was the second coming of the Morrill Act in 1890 that we saw all of the HBCUs and not the BPIs come about. So the state of Maryland did nothing for people of color from a state standpoint. It was the Methodist Church, all these conferences uniting the churches, raising funds, and all of these things to establish Morgan College. So it was the Methodist Church that made it possible for people of color to earn the liberal arts degree. And that's very important, and you'll come to that later, the difference between the liberal arts degree versus the agricultural mechanical. But when you look at, I think it was 1864 is when the state of Maryland established the public education system. And you posed to Dr. Fitch earlier about like why Virginia, and people ask the question why Maryland, and people don't understand that at that time Baltimore, Maryland actually rivaled DC in terms of being a educational, social, cultural capital. I mean, at one time there was something like 3 public high schools for people of color in the nation, and 2 of them were in Baltimore. So if you were a person of color, and whether you had means or not, you were trying to get your children to this area because that was their best chance at 1, getting a high school diploma, and 2, not just earning a degree, but earning a liberal arts degree. And that was really, really, really cutting edge at that time. So, I mean, there are a lot of things that are going on in terms of what the Supreme Court is doing, what the federal government is doing in terms of the Morrill Acts. The NAACP is starting all these test cases and stuff. And
Are you taking us up to the future again?
And I'm
NAACP didn't come around in 1909.
but you have to understand all this conversation in the context of what's actually going on nationwide. And what I was saying, and I'll leave with this, get back to you, was that we established in Maryland a state board of education, if you will, to use today's terminology. And the first superintendent, if you will, I want to say his name was Libertus, believe it or not, Van Bachlen. And when he was posed with the question, they said, should people of color be educated? And his response was something to the effect of, yes, they should be educated because an educated laborer is a more efficient laborer. So that's kind of the thinking at the time where the Methodists are saying, no, we want no A&T and A&M. We want to do all the things that you all are doing. It's the same type of narrative that's going on in the Methodist Church. We want to be able to preach. We want to be elders. We want to be deacons. Everything you're doing in that form we want to do, and we want to do the same thing with our education.
So here in Baltimore, we had Sharp Street then taking the lead with founding or birthing somehow Centennial.
Centenary.
Centenary. Sorry,
Centenary.
Centenary. Yeah, yeah.
Because of the centennial.
Right, because it was a centennial.
Centennial.
I remember that part. And in Lynchburg, we had Jackson Street. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. Well, Jackson Street has been touted nationwide as the single African American, they didn't say African American at the time, church that was most encouraging of education for its people. It had money, it had a large congregation that gave a lot of money, and they were the people that brought the property for VCII and also supported it in other ways. And many of their parishioners were elders and stewards, including Penn and Trigg and Stevens, who was a principal of VCII, and they were the founders of the Virginia Teachers Association, the Black VTA. And so these people, before the school was on the horizon, were heavily involved in administration and also in teaching capacities in Virginia, and also were encouraging the advancement and the career development of teachers. So the Peabody Institutes started, the first one was at Jackson Street, Methodist Episcopal Church. They did several of them, and at the sixth, I think, Peabody that was held again back in Lynchburg, that was when the VTA idea, I think it was called the State Teachers Association at the time, that was when the idea for black teachers organizing was established. So Jackson Street, okay, I can't say what I was going to say, but Jackson Street at the time.
If it was juicy, you can say it.
No, but Jackson Street at the time was really dedicated and was really out there and was touted as being out there nationwide. And everybody who ran through Lynchburg to get from north to south stopped in Lynchburg. There were other churches in Lynchburg that were important. There were Baptist churches, and I can't tell you the names of some of them, but people stopped at Jackson Street Methodist Episcopal Church, and they preached there. Booker T. Washington evidently preached there. I think Martin Luther King, when he came through, teach there. I mean, everybody just showed up, and then they showed up at Ann Spencer's house. Ann Spencer wasn't Methodist Episcopal, but I mean, there were places where people knew they could go, where there were people who were cultured and who would take care of them, but also black people needed a place to stop when they were traveling south, and they couldn't go to a hotel, so they stayed with people who knew people, and Jackson Street was one of those places that opened its doors to students at VCII and anybody passing through that needed a place to stay. So it's an important church, and I really wished that they owned it.
What do you mean that they owned it?
To me, this is our church, this is what we did. And we need to own this for ourselves and to tout it and make sure that what we did was is not forgotten.
So the church still exists?
Oh, yes.
Is it a thriving church?
Well,
I
let
don't
me
know.
just tell you this, because it's, and then I was sitting in the church for 2 years before I went away and came back again, and I've been asking people about VCII and about Frank Trigg. There are 3 stained glass windows that were put up in 1907 in that church. I didn't see them. I didn't pay any attention to them. Frank Trigg was an elder of the church. People looked at me and said, "I don't know what you're talking about." I believe they probably didn't, but my feeling is they should have. They should have.
Well, they should
It's an
know their church.
illustrious history. And as a black person, I think if somebody who wasn't black came in and started writing them up, they'd be outraged. You know, that's our history. How dare you come and appropriate that and write about us? But I was doing it. Now, admittedly, I'm from New York. That could have been a problem. But people are they're just giving away the store. And I'm heartbroken. I have been heartbroken about it for the last 5 years, ever since I retired and went back to Virginia. So today was a big day for me, and I thought I was going to fall out and collapse, because I just wanted something like this to happen so I could tell another audience that this had happened.
Well, we'll have to help you get that story out. And you have people here on this panel who'll be good at that. So let's get to Morgan's opening its campus in Lynchburg. What was the relationship then between the Baltimore campus and Lynchburg when it started?
Well, it was a branch school. It was another place for students who couldn't go to Baltimore because there's no space for them to use that as an option, but also it was the opportunity to have a different kind of curriculum. So you had the basic liberal arts curriculum, but you could do something else. So people went to Princess Anne, or they went to Virginia. I think most of the people at DCII were Virginia people, and if they were Baltimore people, there were a lot of pastors that came from Baltimore who ended up at Jackson Street. Some of them were involved in the administration of DCII. So there was that knowledge of, why don't you go down to Virginia? It's a beautiful site, and you can get a decent education and teach. But I think I don't know that the students in Baltimore were really aware. I think they were more aware of Princess Anne because a lot of Princess Anne teachers were coming from Morgan.
Yeah.
So where VCII was more Virginia people, Princess Anne was more Morgan people until Frank Trigg shows up.
Okay, now we've heard Frank Trigg's
Yeah.
name a lot, so tell us a little bit more about who he was and how he had an impact on all of these things.
Frank Trigg went to Hampton Institute. He was a classmate of Booker T. Washington. He was ahead of him by 2 years. He lost his, this is an interesting story too, he lost his arm in a threshing accident when he was 20 years old, and his owner, not his master, but his owner said, you've got a good head on your shoulders. You lost your arm. You're not going to be a very good agricultural worker. I got a friend, General Armstrong. I just found this connection out a couple of years ago, who has opened a school, Hampton. He took him to Hampton and introduced him to Armstrong, and evidently there was a connection between the two of them. Trigg is always talking about how close he felt to General Armstrong. And from there, he went to a school in Connecticut for a year, a high school in Connecticut, and comes back and ends up teaching in Abingdon, Virginia, western part of the state, and then somehow gets to Lynchburg. I don't know how or why, but within 2 years of going back to Abingdon, where he was born, he ends up in Lynchburg and becomes a local luminary educator. And from then, the rest is pretty much history. But he's not as well known as I. Garland Penn, but I. Garland Penn should be better known. His 100th anniversary of his birth was 2 years ago. Nobody said anything. And I was trying to get a hold of his grandson, who's 90-something and a jazz musician. And I figure out that when I get a hold of him, he would have died the day before. And I don't want to make a joke about that. But nobody has helped me with Penn. And Penn is important as an official in the church. He was the highest ranking forever African-American executive.
In the Methodist Church?
In the Methodist Episcopal Church, yes. I do believe, I had heard this, but I do believe that he was really CME, but he was in the Methodist. Yeah, I do believe that he was. I can't prove it. But there are things that indicate that he might, well, he certainly raised that way, but he became the face of African-American Methodist Episcopalianism at that time.
So before we go much further into BCII, I don't know which of you want to answer this question. Tell us how Princess Anne comes into the picture. When does it come into the picture as one of Morgan's campuses?
Here we go. Well, let me open this up a little bit by saying that the linkage to all of this is really important to understand. I often look at Morgan as a AAA institution. And what I mean by that is we've talked about the role of the institution as it's traced back to its early activism. And we can go back and we can come forward and look at that. We can also examine the role of the institution within achievement. From day one of the opening of its doors, we talk about its first graduate, official college degree graduate, graduates from here, goes to Yale, so forth and what have you, and then where we are today. But one of the little known areas of the A that we talk about, of course, is my area, architecture. And oftentimes we talk about where the first building was, where all of this activity happened. And so I'll sort of bring us a little forward to get to that, to respond to that question. When the institution was first founded, even from the envisioning aspect, this was happening at the original Sharp Street Church, which was at Pratt and Sharp and Lombard, which is at the Baltimore Inner Harbor. So this is before we tout Edmondson and Fulton. So understand that this institution, when it was an idea and a concept, and as Mr. Howells mentioned, they met April 28th through October 31st, because November 1st was going to be Maryland signing the Emancipation Proclamation. So they were one day ahead of everyone who would look like us being free and having this institution established. So they were doing that in the basement of the Sharp Street Methodist Episcopal Church there. After the institution was incorporated, the classes were held there, the Centenary Biblical Institute was held there. It then moved to its first permanent location, which was at Saratoga and St. Paul Street. They had purchased a house there called the Peyton property. It was a 5-story building and a attached house, but a permanent and independent structure for the institution. Otherwise, they were sharing it with Sharp Street Church. They remained there until they purchased the property at Edmondson and Fulton. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is because at the Peyton property, the Morgan Academy, which had an earlier name, which was called the Baltimore City Academy prior to Morgan Academy, was established at the Peyton property. And it was established the same time coinciding with what would have been called the Delaware Conference Academy, later known as the Princess Anne Academy. And this is the year 1886. So that Peyton property is also very important in our history, just like the Virginia Collegiate and Industrial Institute. So Morgan has all of these different places that existed in our history that are, for the most part, lost to many of us who are affiliated with Morgan. And so that Peyton property gave rise to the Delaware Conference Academy that became the Princess Anne Academy of Morgan College. From there, as I said, they moved to the Edmondson and Fulton site, where a building that was designed by architect Frank Davis, who was hired by this Methodist conference that we speak of. He is the same architect that designed the building at the Virginia Collegiate and Industrial Institute, which is on the cover of all of the Founders Day convocation booklets. And it's that same building that Morgan was actually seeking to brand, because this is almost a exact image of what was at Edmondson and Fulton. And he also designed this same building at the Princess Anne Academy. So this same building existed in 3 of Morgan's distinct locations.
So it was kind of like Trump putting his name on everything.
Well, I'm not going to say that. I'm elevating our history. I'm not going to attach it with that person. But it would be today, it would be our Holmes Hall as we see it in these 3 different locations. It's important to understand that the same way the church had a structure and an infrastructure, Morgan was establishing an infrastructure within the built environment and within these places. Because even when you get to this campus from the Edmondson and Fulton location, not only were they establishing this campus, repurposing a former farm, but they were establishing a 25-acre residential community called Morgan Park. All of this was a part of that architecture infrastructure that Morgan was at the helm of. And all of it is very significant, nationally significant, quite frankly. Because of the 9 institutions that were being founded in 1867, Morgan is certainly the only one who had that type of infrastructure. And of the 105 HBCUs, arguably, Morgan is one of the only ones that had that breadth of infrastructure existing in Baltimore, Princess Anne, or Lynchburg, and then, what was happening with Morgan Park within that community. So oftentimes, I like to underscore how architecture is an artifact of our history and our culture that is still with us, and these places, while we don't occupy them anymore, they are very important in the meaning and significance of the founding of our institution.
And we need to find ways to make sure that people know that story. Because as you were saying, Dr. Quarles would tell us that was his story, and we've got to come up with our story. Were you going to say something?
Yeah, I wanted to jump in on Professor Green's comment and not let him leave, because there's a greater story dealing with how significant Baltimore was in terms of the Gallo Hills community, and if you could elaborate that, because that again is another aspect of our history that has literally just kind of been wiped off of the face of the earth. And one of the reasons I'm so excited, because as the president mentioned earlier today, each time we went to celebrate our history, there was snow or something that prevented us from doing this. But, as you were saying with Jackson Street, it's so sad that the history isn't embraced and celebrated. But a lot of the same things can be said about Morgan. And I'm really appreciative of today's convocation, because I know there were a lot of freshmen that were hearing today for the first time about VCII. But it's important to know how significant Baltimore is to the higher education of African Americans in the state of Maryland, because every HBCU that exists today in the state started in a very small, go ahead, I don't want to.
Yeah, so with Dr. Johnson, and no, this is a really important note, because the Peyton property was located in what was historically known as Gallo Hills. Today, Gallo Hills is known as Preston Gardens, and it is renamed in honor of Mayor Preston, whom 100 years ago this year established what was called the Baltimore Segregation Committee, which was the committee that was charged to actually declare that only 2% of the land in Baltimore should be occupied by African Americans. Wow. And so it was a strategic move to relocate African Americans, for which the Gallo Hills community was largely a free black population. And when we moved into that community, at that time, the Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church was in that community. Union Baptist was in that community. And as Dr. Johnson's mentioning, these are the institutions who were giving rise to the other HBCUs in Maryland. Union Baptist gave rise to Bowie State University. We had given rise to Morgan. We had given rise to Princess Anne Academy, that later would be purchased by the state and become the University of Maryland Eastern Shore. And so Coppin and so on. So all of these things were coming out of a community called Gallo Hills. Which,
was it called Gallows because it used to be for hanging, or what was it?
No, I don't know that history. But sadly, it has been renamed. It is largely named, unfortunately, in honor of a mayor who commissioned a segregation committee that led to the massive racially segregated areas in the city of Baltimore and so forth. But with that, the loss and the erasure, so to speak, of this early history associated not only with Morgan, but of black education in Maryland, of the large free black population in Maryland, of the black institutions of Maryland, like Bethel AME Church and Union Baptist, Baltimore rather, and all these other places that were densely populated in that area. So it was a very important place.
And what I would say is, so while we were ignoring federal laws that said you must do this for people of color, the mayor is saying, not only we're not going to do this, we're going to take away what you have and just wipe it off the face of the earth.
Wow. What was happening with the Methodist Church, Dr. Barrett? You said at some point, because of the Civil War,
okay, that was
we had a split. How did that affect what was going on?
Okay, well, we were still considered Methodist North. In 1844, J.O. Andrew of Georgia received slaves as a gift. His bride was gifted slaves, and because women couldn't own property, they became his slaves. And the Methodist Church kept moving the line. First, okay, they didn't want any members to hold, own slaves. Then you couldn't be an official and own slaves, but because he was one of the ministers of the church, they said, no, you can't have him. And he's like, yes, I am. And the church split. They split in the north and the south, right? In the southern, even though we're a southern state, we was considered the north, because no one that I knew of out of, the early ministers at Lovely Lane owned slaves, anything like that, yeah.
So Morgan is founded in 67. Princess Anne was what year?
1886.
86.
86. And Virginia Collegiate was 93. So Virginia Collegiate exists from 93 to 1917. What was college life like there?
There's so few documents, but going to the Morgan College Bulletin when they had a section on VCII, they had a gospel choir, they had the Epworth League, they had when the YMCA was established, they had a branch there. They were very active. I think in that community, which is now the Fairview Heights community, that was a cultural center. Now, I don't want to not mention, let me see if I can get the title right, the Virginia Theological Seminary and College, which is now Virginia. No, it's not Virginia Union, but it's Virginia University of Lynchburg, something.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and it's the Baptist school on the other side of Richmond Road. So these two schools really did support each other. When Frank Trigg resigned from there, he was supposed to retire, and he goes to Bennett in Greensboro. People from the theological seminary crossed the road and took part in the reception. Students did things together. So I can't tell you a lot about student life. I know that they kept the place going. That was how some of them were able to afford the tuition. The young women who went to church on Sundays went with the matron who took them to church services. The bus was down at the foot of the road. It was in the city, the bus, and they would take the bus up to this part of, it was actually part of southern corporate Lynchburg, and the catalogs talk about how you would get off the bus and walk a distance and to get to campus. A gentleman took me, he's a barber, he is now blind. I met him at the Jones Memorial Library. I didn't know him from Adam. I'm not the most trusting person in the world, but I thought, oh, he's got stuff from VCII. So I drove him home. He walked to the Jones Memorial. He's Caucasian, I know everything you need to know about VCII, and he did kind of, sort of. And he took me to where the trees and the new property had been purchased, and he said there were cedar trees here and there were oak trees here, and it was, to me, it was heartbreaking, and that's why I was focusing on loss for so much, because I could envision what had been there that he had seen, and it broke my heart. It had such great potential. You look down and you could see the city below, and in the distance the Blue Ridge Mountains. It was just an ideal place, and it was just about to turn the corner. Except I shouldn't have been concerned about the corner. It did what it did for 25 years, and it fulfilled the mission of the Washington Conference in 1864. It could have done more if it could have lasted more, I guess. We don't know that, but
The fire comes in 1917.
Yes, it's during Christmas holiday.
What was the status of the school then? Was it in good financial condition? Was it
it was
thriving?
This was when it was turning the corner. It was getting more money. It was going to cover up the tracks. The cover, you can still see it, or they redid it so you can walk from the street and not have to be worried about the railroad intersection. They were really making a difference. They had bought more property because they were going to build a dormitory for the boys. The dormitories were in that one building. Everything except
So
for
the one
labs
building was the college.
Was the campus,
Right,
yeah.
okay.
But they said it was a commodious building, so evidently it was really big. And I've got pictures of the bottom floors of the building in Baltimore. It was big. So, you know, when you go up, and the fire, I'm surprised that stone would have burned like that. I don't understand.
What caused the fire?
The fire started in the attic. I do not believe it was arson. I do believe that there was a problem with water pressure, which is why the North Carolina Women's Conference did not put a school there, because they were trying to get the city of Lynchburg to upgrade the water supply, and for whatever reason, everything fell through, and now you've got Bennett College for Women in Greensboro instead of the young ladies seminary that they were going to put on the property
So the
in
North
Lynchburg.
Carolina Conference was also looking to go to.
Yeah, because
Virginia.
the property was just, nothing was happening with it. And so finally they said, well, why don't, and this was the last, it was in 26, 27. The last year that Frank Trigg was at Bennett was when these negotiations, and I don't know his part in it, were taking place with the city of Lynchburg. And the issue, one of the issues, Lynchburg was supposed to give the conference money and they didn't do it, but the main issue I think was water. And I think the fire was exacerbated because the trucks couldn't get up the hill in time, and the water pressure wasn't heavy enough to put out the flames.
Because
And
the
the
fire's
fire
in the
starts
attic.
in the attic.
Right, okay.
So
So the
it's just,
fire destroys the school. Why wasn't it rebuilt there?
they thought about rebuilding, but the building itself was $30,000. The property was more. The insurance was $14,000. They thought about rebuilding, but Morgan was having financial issues. It couldn't redo something, so they just said, we're not going to do that, and we're going to move the remaining students that were going to graduate to Baltimore.
Before we move to Baltimore, though, let's not overlook the story of the heroic
I didn't know that story, by the way.
Ms. Wolfert. Anyone want to tell us
Yeah.
that story?
Well, she died in the
But tell them who
major.
she was.
But nobody died in that fire. I
She
think-
died. She
No, she
succumbed
died
to
after.
her.
She had
Yes,
smoke
yes,
insulation
she-
and all
yes,
that.
yeah,
Yeah.
okay.
Well, tell
yeah.
us who she was.
I wanted to go back.
Okay.
You were asking about what college life was like, right?
Uh-huh.
And I just happened to find some things from some news reports, which I thought were rather interesting. The Washington Evening Star, a paper called The Colored American. You can look all these up online, but it's interesting. June 11th, 2004. The 11th commencement
1904.
exercise, 1904.
Okay. 2004. We're back to the future.
But the 11th commencement exercise took place on May 22nd to the 26th. The graduating class is very large, excelling the numbers that of many years. The annual sermon was delivered at May 22nd in Jackson Street. Then they talk about the colored American, Mrs. R.E. Lawson, an organizer for the Women's Christian Temperance Reunion. And I thought these things were interesting because, the kind of speakers they were bringing in, alcoholism
Yes, yeah.
was a big problem. They talked about men needing to respect their women and leave the drinking alone and those kinds of things. But these were discussions which were being held at the college in the chapel. So the Colored American said Mrs. R.E. Lawson was accompanied by Mrs. Nelson Spiller and Mrs. M.E. Wright, who had visited VCI. This was presided over by G.E. Stevens, who was the president of his
Yes,
She
yeah.
urged the girls to ally themselves to those organizations whose purpose is to fortify the home. Mrs. Lawson also addressed Diamond Hill Baptist Church and urged the attendees to live purer lives and more respect on the part of our men for our women, and to abstain from strong drinks.
But that was why when
I also had something called, in May of 2003, the Benjamin Banneker Literary Society. The address was delivered there by J.W. Taylor of Bedford Springs. And then the Institute takes this year's first prize for oration and the first prize for hymns among academies on the Stewart Missionary Foundation of Africa. But all of these I thought were interesting. Then the Bee reported that the 20th District Conference on the Methodist Church was held in Middlebury, Virginia, and visitors to that conference included Frank Trigg of VCI. Then the Colored American came in, and Dr. Spencer from Morgan was in attendance. Then the Colored American on June 8, 1901, notwithstanding the disenfranchising measures, the Jim Crow car, and yellow politics in Virginia, the work of education goes speedily on. An invitation has just been received at the commencement exercise of the VC Virginia the Virginia Seminary. The program has been carefully prepared. The faculty consists of W.J. Wagner, president, George B. Stevens, Lucy Stevens, and Susie Whitlock, who was one of the instructors. So I thought
So that was the beginning of the 20th century. So I'm going to bring it back to 1917, and I'll read this from the bulletin that we had this morning. Harriet Wolfert, shortly after graduating from school here in Baltimore, worked as a teacher and then dormitory matron at VCII in Lynchburg. On December 10, 1917, a fire destroyed the school, but not before she managed to save all the students housed in the building. Tragically, she died not long after the fire. Morgan College then recognized her by naming one of its buildings and later its college infirmary in her honor. I see one student there. You know that's what the infirmary is named? For Wolfert. Now you know. And they're going to put a plaque up there telling you guys more about that. The survivors of the Lynchburg fire were the first residents to reside at the Ivy Mills site of Morgan College. So that I'm jumping ahead a little bit myself. So we have the fire in December, and the decision is made not to rebuild there for a number of reasons, but a decision is made immediately to bring the students from Lynchburg to Baltimore. At that time, Morgan was in the process of trying to come to where we are now. Which of you want to pick up the story a little bit? Dr. Barrett
first.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
and then we'll have
Yeah,
the two of you can tell the story.
Yeah, and-
What were they bringing these girls and boys to?
Well, let me offer this as a ray of hope also to Dr. Fitch, because when I examine the history of the VCII, I don't look at it as a lost history per se, particularly when we address this component, because when you look at the sort of spiritual thoughts, if you will, of the founders and the beliefs of early people of color within Christianity, and what the Bible says about some things having to die in order for things to be reborn. Had that college not burned and been destroyed by fire, and those students not been brought to this location, what we can tell you, which Dr. Barrett will read, so you can see as a follow-up, is that those students made this location possible. Because during that time, where we sit was Baltimore County, and it had not been annexed into the city. And Morgan only purchased this property under the cover of darkness. And the racial tension was so high. In fact, it was Edgar Allan Poe's grandson, who was the attorney that was representing the white community, who would even make comments such as the people of color will taint the very air that we breathe.
Think of what we're now hearing about the invasion that's approaching the nation right now.
Absolutely. So all of this was going on while we were still at the Edmondson and Fulton location, had not relocated to this site. But those students brought all the way from Lynchburg, Virginia, to the main quad of our campus, which was the original 65-acre tract of land known as the Ivy Mill and Farm. And the first building they renamed was in honor of the Washington Conference, the black conference that gave rise to the institution, which was Walter Thorne's original Ivy Hotel. But then that hall, which they renamed Wolfert Hall, was named in honor of Harriet Wolfert, who you just gave her brief history because of her heroic efforts, and she died after saving those students later. But those students are the reason that we are all able to assemble on this campus. Those students are the reason that that case, because Dr. Barrett will go through the numerous court cases that were brought about to prevent the relocation to this site. And I just think it's so remarkable and also divine that those students were here, and only because of them. And it's just amazing that Dr. Barrett has those records in that regard.
So let her tell us about
So we
that.
don't have to make it like, spiritual, and somebody just throwing it up. It's real, and had not for that scenario, this history could be remarkably different because it was all conditional. Andrew Carnegie's grant that led to us building the first building, purchasing land, was conditional. But that alone wasn't satisfied by us just purchasing the property. So Dr. Barrett, share that context with the audience.
Okay, now the letter I have I got it from Lovely Lane. It's dated August 27th, 1913. This is when we first wanted to move into Mount Washington. We had 3 locations that we had looked at. We had looked at Mount Washington, Park Heights, and then we came here. We were able to buy the property here, but it's from an attorney by the name of Edwin Donovan Hans, and Mr. Hans, kind of he's writing to John Goucher. If nobody knew that, Goucher's Women's College, John Goucher was the board chairman for 35 years.
For Morgan.
For Morgan, right. So this letter was directly to him, and it basically says that it has been brought to my attention that negotiations are pending for the purchase of a certain property in Mount Washington to be used for a site for Morgan College. I can scarcely believe the rumors that are well-founded that one of Baltimore's oldest and most conservative suburbs should be invaded with such an institute of this character. My home is in the immediate vicinity and the contemplated site, and I am therefore very deeply interested. Now, not only did they write these letters, there's a court case. Now, the court case was filed August 1st, 1917, and that's the court case to actually stop them from coming here to this location. And it was four couples out of Laurelville. It was Diggs, Russell Diggs, Samuel Lauder, George Frankton, and William Henry Beck. And basically what they were saying, their property values would go down, and it wasn't so much about Morgan. You know what it was really about?
Morgan Park.
Morgan Park. They did not want the Negro colony, is what they called it.
The Negro colony?
The Sun paper headline, and I can't find the exact reference, but the paper, and they had the actual paper at Lovely Lane that says Morgan College and Negro Colony to follow. So they were more upset, not so much that the college was going to be here, but there was going to be a black community. And they said it was a black community of people that were not affiliated with the college. So that was the biggest hang-up.
And so they're talking about the character. What were they talking about? Because the college didn't have a bad reputation.
They just didn't want black people.
I know that.
Right,
But
but
what were they talking about?
But you also have to understand that blacks were also associated with tuberculosis and
just being
and
unclean.
cholera and all of these diseases. I mean, we look at sanitation today under our lens, but if you can imagine what trash collection and things were like during this time. So all of the negative association. What is the other disease? I can't say it right. It's C.
Typhoid.
Not typhoid. It's a C. CH.
Color.
Yeah. And I mean, almost until the 60s, blacks were associated and supposedly responsible for the spread of all of these diseases. So it was like these black people are coming with this colony, and they're going to infest all of us, and we're all going to get sick, and our property values going, and there's going to be crime and lawlessness, and you know we need to build walls and stuff.
So I was going to say it's a similar conversation we're hearing,
Right.
but
If it had
because these people from Lynchburg were here, upstanding young people, you had Exhibit A. That you people don't know what the hell you're talking about.
right, because they've been here and they've been here for a minute,
The students
and they've been here for a minute, and we've had no problems.
of character.
Right, so that's
And the
why.
attorneys used that for clarity as the exhibit that enabled that case to be thrown out. And that's why I say, but for those students being relocated to this site, that case could have resulted in us not being on this campus. And I just think that that is so powerful. And that is a part that we haven't elevated to the level that we should and can now, that physically attaches us to Lynchburg Virginia Collegiate Industrial Institute and the Lynchburg, Virginia campus.
I think as we're going to begin to, maybe if you all have any questions, think of them, but as we begin to take this towards the end, Dr. Fitch, where do you see your research going now on Virginia Collegiate?
Well, I've been going back and forth. I'm going to pull out Frank Trigg and finish a biography of him. It's not going to be very extensive, but I've been tripping over more and more info. The more I find out, the more I find out. And I started looking at the teachers in Lynchburg and the conferences in Virginia and finding these names of principals from VCII when they go and give papers or moderate meetings, and so it's led me into other areas. I want to finish up with Frank Trigg. I want to find his family, and then
Maybe you can work with Jackson Street on telling its story?
oh, I don't.
You don't think they?
I don't think so.
No? Okay. But somebody should work with
Well,
Jackson
you know,
Street.
Jackson Street, I mean, they have I have more information that I've given them than they have put in their anniversary catalogs, which is fine. But it's very, I have more and I've given it to them, but that's not, I'm banging my head up against the wall and I'm not going to do it anymore. I do have some very nice colleagues, friends from Jackson Street, and they understand where I'm coming from, and I'm going to move on from that. That's not going to happen. I will make sure that that the church, and I've got to make sure that it says church, because it ended up with somebody else who said that belonged to him, and so the church hasn't seen anything. So, you know, I just have to be careful that there is an institutional memory. But I was going to pay with their design for a stained glass window. I was going to do that a couple of years ago. I even thought of doing the historical marker, not knowing that you were going to do it. And about the time that you guys started working on that, I decided I wasn't going to do it, either one, because I didn't think anybody cared. I mean, anybody there. So no stained glass window for me, and no working on the historical marker either. And that's very sad. But I just thought, why? Why do I care more? If people don't care, or some people, not all people, don't care about themselves, how do you expect other people to care about you? Why should they? So
That reminds me, Mr. Howes, as a member of the centennial class of Morgan, you said that it was through the process of learning in preparation for some of the events you were having as a member of that class, and then again through preparing for last year's activities, that you came to appreciate more of this lost history. Tell us a little bit more about that and what it means to you.
Well, as I said, you know, when Dr. Hollis and I were students, and even at Lovely Lane, when exploring Lovely Lane, just getting Dr. Green and I were there, very little information could we find on that celebration. So this has really been an opportunity as you were saying, to fill in that history. But I hope we aren't just filling it in. The kinds of evidence, this kind of research that's being done is so important. And I am just one of those proponents that say if we're going to talk about history, one of the courses that needs to be talked about here is to incorporate this history into our curriculum. You know, this is all a part of Reconstruction history. This is a part of American history. So I just think that's important. I found something, if you'll bear with me. You know, sometimes you come over-prepared.
That's okay.
You're a Morgan man.
You come over-prepared. But I found something, you know, which I thought was really interesting about this history and how important it was. Now, this was a point made by Robert Russell Moulton, who's another figure in Virginia. But he wrote an article which appeared in the London Times, June 14, 1921, giving a summary of racial progress. And this is why I think telling this history is so important. Here's what he says. Our race left the veils of slavery 57 years ago, empty-handed. By thrift and energy, Negroes today operate 900,000 farms in the South. They cultivate in the South approximately 100 million acres of land, of which 52 million are under the control of Negro farmers. The Negro owns and operates various businesses to the number of 38,382, not including such lines as barbershops, shoe shops, and blacksmith shops. Then he goes on about education. Negro illiteracy has been reduced from 90% in 1863 to 20% in 1921. And that's a telling story about Morgan and Virginia
Virginia Collegiate.
Over 2 million Negro children are in public schools. Over 100,000 are in normal schools and colleges. In 1867, there were 699 colored teachers. In 1920, there are more than 40,000. In 1866, there were 15 colleges in the entire country in which Negroes were admitted. Today, there are 500 normal schools and colleges for Negro with an enrollment of more than 100,000 students. Those are startling accomplishments. Then they go on to say here, there were 300,000 Negroes in white churches before the Civil War. In 1866, there were 700 Negro churches with 600,000 communicants and church property valued at 500,000. Now, there are 43,000 Negro churches with 4,800,000 communicants with church property valued at $86 million.
We're talking about from 1860s to 1921.
1921. What? I mean, 57 years, that is just simply incredible. I just look at the genius of our people. You know, this is stuff. This is good stuff.
And with those profound remarks, let's open up questions and learn about more good stuff. Are there any questions from the audience? Yes.
I know you have a lot. My question was to Dr. Fish about just your interest in South Asian. You said you did South Asian history.
Oh,
I know
yeah.
that's like completely random, so I'm just like intrigued how you.
I went to a college, Oakland University, which at the time was part of Michigan State University, and as part of our core courses, we either had to take Chinese studies or South Asian studies. I was going to do China, and I thought, you must be kidding because your language skills are nil. So I did the India instead, got really interested. My mentors were Indian males. and actually both of them were Muslim. It's absolutely incredible, my history. But I stayed with it, but I got a degree in history, not in South Asian studies, because that would be too limiting. And then my professors, there was no place for us to go at some point, so we all went into American history, and then I also went into African American, and that's how I got involved in this. For a long time, I tried to stay in nationalist Indian studies, and there were no jobs. So, and then the subcontinent started changing so quickly. I kept up, and then I couldn't keep up anymore because everything was happening overnight. So that was how I got into it in the first place. And I was glad. I was the calmest person you'd ever want to meet. I studied Buddhism and all this stuff. Nothing fazed me. I became an American again, and it's just been nutty ever since.
All right. Any other questions?
So that was one of my questions. Thank you very much. And did you see any parallels, if I could extend the discussion, especially with reference to colonial schools and colleges in India and Pakistan?
Well, I was really looking at the nationalist period, so I wasn't doing much with education, and then also British imperial history. So that really wasn't something I looked at, but the whole colonial mentality. Well, the history is a nightmare. That was less about schools than about what gets into your head and how you perpetuate what other people put in here, and then you're in real trouble because there's no sense of real self-identity. One of the people I studied for my dissertation was V.S. Naipaul. And the whole idea that he not only rejected to me who he was, but then was scornful of it. And I thought that was part of what I call the exilic, EXILIC experience, and that came from colonialism, and it didn't have to just be in a school. It just had to be in the air.
Mm-hmm. So that exilic experience, do you see that as a correlation in African American studies abroad?
With African American studies abroad, or with African Americans here? Oh yeah, I see it every day.
Yes.
And
Can you elaborate on that?
but it's not just. It is with African Americans, but I think it's with just about everybody. Other people kind of tell you what you should be thinking, and it's so easy to let other people do for you. And unfortunately, one of the things some of us do, not me, is to let people tell you how to think. I don't have too many friends anymore because though I will listen to what they say, and though they might be correct, I might disagree. It's not reciprocal. Anything I say has got to be wrong if they don't agree with it. So there's no point in talking anymore because it's too hard.
This
Yeah.
is beautiful. This is very
No, it's not. It's very sad. I know what you mean. I know.
Okay, so one more question because we got to get some others in here.
Okay, so I'm going to go to my question 5 directly.
Question 5?
Oh, yeah.
Well, we'll come back around. Like do this question, and
I'm just going to ask my question 1 and 5.
Okay.
2, 3, 4. So the 5th question is, how do we distill this very powerful heritage of Morgan in our contemporary curriculum, especially with the threat of STEM-centered education?
The president asked me that, and then he had to go and fly away. It's not easy. I don't know. Okay, let me just, because this could go on forever. I think we have to start with the fact that there's only one race, and it's the human race. And there's no such thing as black blood. And I think once we realize that we are human beings, and that we are prone to certain things that are not really good, like racism and discrimination and violence. Once we understand that that's a part of our DNA and we work hard to overcome it, I don't think more legislation and more talking about it is going to solve the issue. I think people have to feel more, and I don't think the STEM curriculum is effective. So I think we've got driverless cars because some kid was sitting in a cubicle not talking to anybody and came up with this brilliant idea, except you can't take the human being out of it, and that's where we're headed. That's where we're headed with AI. The perfect human being is not going to be flesh and bone and blood. It's going to be a machine. And I'm glad I'm the age that I am, even though it makes me nervous, because I don't want to see that. And I don't have any children, so I don't have to worry about being around for them.
But we're gonna see more AI.
Yeah,
We're
yeah.
definitely gonna see more AI.
That's STEM.
Yes.
This is a question for anybody on the panel. And what this conversation has done is that it has raised some questions that I've had before. Has anybody heard of Chilembwe? Chilembwe.
Yeah.
He was the person who was responsible for an uprising in Nyasaland, which is now, I think, Malawi, I think. And this happened in around 1916, I think, or sometime before the First World War. The story of the uprising is written by a Scottish person whose name is Shepherdson, I think. And in that book, he talks about Chilembwe coming to the United States and probably being, I would say, infected by some American thoughts. And there are two things. He came to Morgan, and he went to Virginia, although they didn't name the school. So I was wondering, did anybody ever hear about him? He was visiting, and I think he must have spent about a year in the States, and he came to Morgan.
Can you spell his name?
CHILEMBWE.
I've heard that name, but I don't know why.
W-E.
I'll look it up, and then I can let you know, and okay. I have seen the name.
Yeah, because in the book, and it's not even a footnote.
Right.
So this would have been pre-World War I?
Pre-World War I, yes. It's not even a footnote. It's just mentioned that he came to Morgan in Baltimore and that he went to school
Virginia.
in Virginia.
Okay.
And
Maybe another
of
interesting
course,
chapter.
Yes,
this,
yes.
this is, since he came to Morgan, it is most likely that he went to the Morgan Sister School.
Yes,
in
possibly.
Virginia.
And the
I've
book
seen
is
that name,
Before
yeah.
the uprising, is that?
No, I don't remember the name of the book.
Oh, okay.
But the book is about the uprising in
In
Malawi
Nyasaland.
and in Nyasaland, and it was led by this man Chilembwe.
Chilembwe.
Other?
Thanks, Dr.
Yes.
Pond.
Two questions. How many students were actually transferred to Morgan? And during at the demise of the school, what was the enrollment?
It's like 75. I
What, you're
think.
talking about BCII?
Yes.
Yes.
Graduating students came to Morgan, and there were 10 young women who came. Their enrollment had gone up, and it was, I think, in 1917, it was 76, and it had been before 1915 about 46, and it was up and down, but it was increasing because they were looking abroad, which means maybe even into other states besides Virginia because of the reputation of Morgan itself. But at least I have been able to identify 100 graduates of the normal school, meaning that they had teaching certificates. There might have been as many as 200 students. Still trying to find names. They also had a grammar school, which was the model school for the teachers, and I don't know, those are not part of the 100 and 200, but I don't know how many students went through to the 8th grade. And everybody didn't come to Baltimore. It was just a handful of people with the principal.
What happened to the other students?
Well, students had gone home, most of them for a
Christmas
holiday,
break.
so there was no, if they were not going to imminently graduate, I don't know what they did. They could very well have gone to Morgan itself, but I really can't say.
Or to
Because the
the-
feeder school idea was that, you'd have 2 years, you could have a terminal thing, which was the teaching certificate, or you could move on to Morgan or to another 4-year school. I don't know what happened to them.
Other questions? Okay.
I have a question. I did see the lawsuits. Why are we saying that the 10 students, there's something in that that says that the presence of those students made it possible?
If you look at those, and I like the way that Professor Green coached it, but it's almost like those students were kind of like the sacrificial lamb for this site, because it was Edgar Allan Poe's cousin, uncle, grandson, who was representing the Laurelville, and I actually live in Laurelville.
Okay.
It's now part of the Morgan Community Line.
Yes, exactly.
So he's going on and saying talking about all of these horrible things that are going to happen once you bring these black people here, X, Y, Z. Once you bring those black, so President Spencer just sat and he just listened and listened, and the guys, once these students, once these students, once, and then after he finished, he said they're already here, and they've been here.
Snap.
So that was, as he said, evidence that everything that you said was completely untrue. These kids have been here on the property that you're talking about, and none of those things that you have been pontificating about have happened.
Can I ask you, well, you would know, are President Spencer's papers here, or did he have papers, or?
Yeah, they're in the archives.
They are?
Oh, really?
Okay.
John Spencer was, for those
I'm
who
gonna have to
don't
come
recognize the name, John Spencer was which president? He was president of 1902.
Oh, he was forgetting the interim, he was 1902 to 1937.
So he would have been president at the time of the demise of Virginia, and also as Morgan was developing in this part of town.
The one that made contact with Carnegie and
Carnegie said, I'll give you $50,000 and you raise the other $50,000, and he did.
Yes, he did.
He's incredible. He's also handsome.
That's another remarkable story. You know, we talk about the money. You know, every time I look in some of these archives in these journals of the Methodist Church, a wealth of information. But you see names listed. Ida Jones, 50 cents. Morgan, the college had campaigns that they had something called, a prayer week, a prayer day, a penny a week. And that's how a lot of that $50,000 to match Carney was raised. So you see evidence of this in the records of the Delaware Conference and the records of the Washington Conference. And they do like they used to do in my old church. Somebody walked up to the front and they gave a penny, they recorded it. And these monies are recorded, but these are the heroines and the heroes who provided this money. This is a great sacrifice.
Well, on that note, I think we will draw to a close. It's been a wonderful discussion. I thank all of the members of the panel and Dr. Fitch for enlightening all of us who are here. And I'm looking forward personally to learning much, much more as each of you in your own way is pursuing this story of Morgan State University's history.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.